but the studio did not want me. They tried everything to really keep me from being in the film because they felt that I would, and they were right, that I was not of an equal stature to Paul Newman.
For decades, the friendship between Robert Redford and Paul Newman has been celebrated as one of Hollywood's greatest partnerships, a bond that seemed untouched by ego, rivalry, or scandal. But behind the legendary smiles, blockbuster success, and unforgettable interviews was a far more complicated relationship than fans ever imagined. Years after Newman's passing, Redford has finally opened up about moments that were rarely discussed publicly, revealing difficult truths, lingering regrets, and tensions that reshaped how he viewed one of the most important people in his life. Was their friendship really as perfect as Hollywood wanted everyone to believe, or had the warning signs been there all along? Long before they became one of Hollywood's most beloved duos, Robert Redford and Paul Newman were traveling two very different roads to stardom. To audiences today, it's almost impossible to imagine one without eventually thinking of the other. Their names have become permanently linked through two legendary films and decades of mutual admiration. But in the early years, there was little reason to believe their paths would ever cross in a meaningful way. Paul Newman had already established himself as one of Hollywood's brightest stars during the 1950s. With striking blue eyes, effortless charisma, and a growing list of acclaimed performances, he quickly became one of the industry's most recognizable leading men. Whether he was playing rebellious heroes or emotionally complex characters, Newman possessed a rare combination of confidence and vulnerability that audiences couldn't resist. Yet despite his growing fame, Newman never seemed entirely comfortable with the celebrity that surrounded him. Friends often described him as surprisingly private, a man who preferred family life and meaningful work over the constant spotlight. He enjoyed racing cars, dedicated himself to charitable causes, and often joked about Hollywood's obsession with image. Behind the famous smile was someone who viewed fame as a byproduct rather than a destination. Robert Redford's journey looked very different. Unlike Newman, Redford's rise was slower and filled with uncertainty. Before becoming an actor, he struggled to find direction. He spent time studying art, traveled through Europe, and searched for a career that truly fit him. Acting wasn't an obvious choice at first. In many ways, it became the path that gradually revealed itself rather than one he deliberately chased. When Redford finally began appearing on television and Broadway, industry insiders noticed something unique. He possessed a quiet intensity that contrasted sharply with many of Hollywood's larger-than-life personalities. Instead of commanding every room with loud confidence, Redford often drew attention simply by saying less. That reserved nature became part of his appeal. As his film career accelerated throughout the 1960s, critics praised him for bringing intelligence and subtle emotion to his performances. Audiences admired his natural screen presence, but colleagues also noticed that he approached acting differently from many of his contemporaries. He was analytical, thoughtful, and sometimes even cautious about the roles he accepted. On paper, Newman and Redford seemed almost like opposites. Newman projected effortless confidence. Redford projected quiet reflection. Newman often disarmed people with humor. Redford tended to observe before speaking. One seemed completely at ease with people. The other often appeared more comfortable keeping a certain distance. These differences became part of their identities, and Hollywood naturally assumed they would never become especially close. Studios regularly paired actors who shared similar personalities or competitive ambitions. Newman and Redford didn't fit that formula. In fact, some executives reportedly questioned whether audiences would even accept the pairing. Why place two major leading men together when each could easily headline a film alone? The gamble seemed risky. Neither actor needed the other to succeed. Each already had a thriving career. Each had built a loyal audience. Yet sometimes the greatest partnerships emerge precisely because the individuals involved bring completely different strengths to the table. Behind the scenes, both men shared qualities that weren't immediately obvious. Neither enjoyed the endless publicity machine that came with celebrity. Both valued authenticity over glamour. Both cared deeply about choosing meaningful projects rather than simply chasing larger paychecks. And perhaps most importantly, neither was interested in treating every fellow actor as a rival. Those shared values quietly laid the groundwork for something much bigger than anyone expected. Still, no one could have predicted what would happen when Hollywood finally brought them together. When the project that would become Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid began taking shape, producers faced a difficult challenge. Casting two iconic outlaws required actors who could command the screen individually while creating believable chemistry together. Finding one major star was difficult enough. Finding two who could complement rather than overshadow each other seemed nearly impossible. Some executives wondered whether enormous egos would inevitably collide. Others questioned whether audiences would spend the entire film comparing the actors instead of following the story. Even before cameras rolled, expectations were enormous. For Newman and Redford, however, the collaboration represented more than another movie. It would become the beginning of one of Hollywood's most memorable creative partnerships, a relationship built not on competition, but on mutual respect. Yet first impressions can be misleading. While the cameras would soon capture effortless chemistry, the reality behind building that partnership was far more complicated than audiences ever realized. And as production began, subtle differences between the two stars started surfacing in ways that would shape both the film and the friendship that followed. When production began on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, few people on set could have predicted they were witnessing the birth of one of the most celebrated screen partnerships in Hollywood history. The film had enormous expectations resting on its shoulders, but there was one question that mattered more than any other. Would Paul Newman and Robert Redford actually work together? On paper, the casting looked almost too ambitious. Newman was already an established superstar with years of success behind him. Redford, while rapidly rising, was still proving himself as a leading man. The imbalance could easily have created tension. Instead, something unexpected happened. Rather than competing for attention, the two actors seemed to instinctively understand what the story needed. Newman never treated Redford like someone who had to earn his place. Likewise, Redford showed deep respect for Newman's experience without allowing himself to disappear into the background. That balance became the secret ingredient audiences would later fall in love with. Director George Roy Hill quickly realized he wasn't simply directing two talented actors. He was watching two very different personalities create a rhythm that couldn't be manufactured. Newman was spontaneous. Redford was methodical. Newman often relied on instinct. Redford liked preparation. Instead of clashing, those differences complemented each other. One brought energy. The other brought restraint. One pushed scenes forward. The other grounded them emotionally. Their conversations between takes reflected that same balance. Crew members often described an atmosphere filled with laughter rather than rivalry. Newman loved teasing Redford, while Redford appreciated Newman's ability to keep difficult shooting days lighthearted. The practical jokes became almost legendary. Whenever tension started creeping onto the set, Newman had a habit of breaking it with humor. Redford, though more reserved, eventually embraced the playful environment. Their growing trust began showing up on screen in subtle ways that no script could have written. That chemistry became the heartbeat of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Audiences didn't just believe they were watching two outlaws. They believed they were watching two genuine friends. When the film premiered in 1969, it became both a commercial success and a cultural phenomenon. Critics praised the performances, but fans focused on something even more remarkable: the effortless connection between its two stars. Hollywood immediately took notice. Studios wanted another collaboration. Fans wanted another adventure. Journalists wanted to know whether the friendship on screen existed off-screen. For the most part, the answer seemed to be yes. Interviews from the period often showed Newman and Redford exchanging jokes, complimenting each other's work, and speaking with obvious admiration. There was no visible jealousy over salaries, screen time, or media attention. That alone was unusual in Hollywood. But success has a way of changing expectations. After Butch Cassidy, people no longer saw Newman and Redford as separate actors. They became a package. Every appearance together generated headlines. Every interview invited comparisons. Every future project sparked rumors of another reunion. Several years later, those expectations became reality with The Sting. Once again directed by George Roy Hill, The film reunited the pair in another story built around wit, trust, and deception. Once again, audiences couldn't get enough. The movie became another massive success. By then, Newman and Redford weren't simply respected actors. They were Hollywood royalty. Yet beneath that success, subtle differences were becoming harder to ignore. Their careers were beginning to move in different directions. Newman increasingly devoted time to automobile racing, philanthropy, and producing meaningful projects outside traditional Hollywood formulas. His priorities were gradually expanding beyond acting alone. Redford, meanwhile, became increasingly passionate about filmmaking itself. He wanted greater creative control, eventually moving toward directing and supporting independent cinema. That vision would later help shape one of the most influential institutions in American filmmaking. Neither path was wrong. They were simply different. As years passed, their schedules rarely aligned the way they once had. Publicly, nothing appeared unusual. Whenever asked about one another, both men spoke warmly. They praised each other's talent. They respected each other's choices. They celebrated each other's achievements. But friendships, even strong ones, change over time. Life becomes busier. Families grow. Interests evolve. Distance quietly replaces routine. In Hollywood, where careers often move at relentless speed, maintaining close friendships becomes even more difficult. Some observers began wondering why the two icons weren't seen together as often anymore. Had they argued? Had success created competition? Had the friendship faded? The rumors rarely came with evidence, yet speculation persisted because people struggled to accept that relationships naturally evolve. Neither Newman nor Redford publicly fueled those rumors. Instead, both consistently emphasized mutual respect whenever interviews turned toward their partnership. Still, there were hints that the Bond audiences imagined wasn't exactly the same behind closed doors. Not because resentment had replaced friendship, but because life had taken them in directions no blockbuster film could ever capture. Years later, after Paul Newman's death, Robert Redford would reflect on those years with a level of honesty that surprised many longtime fans. His words weren't filled with scandal. They were filled with something far more powerful: regret. And those reflections would reveal that even Hollywood's greatest friendships can leave behind conversations that are never finished. 4 years after their final major collaboration, Robert Redford rarely spoke at length about Paul Newman. When interviewers brought up Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid or The Sting, he would usually smile, share a memorable anecdote, and praise Newman's remarkable talent. It was the kind of response fans expected: warm, respectful, and consistent with the image of two lifelong friends. But as time passed, especially after Newman's death in 2008, Redford's reflections became noticeably more personal. The stories weren't changing. His perspective was, instead of focusing only on legendary films or box office success, Redford began talking about something much harder to define: what it means to lose someone who has quietly shaped your life for decades. That shift caught many people by surprise. Hollywood often celebrates friendships while everyone is alive. Tributes are full of glowing compliments, humorous memories, and carefully chosen words. But grief has a way of stripping away polished narratives, replacing them with honesty that is often less dramatic, but far more meaningful. Redford's comments reflected exactly that. He didn't reveal a shocking betrayal. He didn't accuse Newman of wrongdoing. And he certainly didn't dismantle the respect they had for one another. Instead, he admitted something that many people recognized from their own lives. Time had slipped away faster than either of them expected. As their careers expanded, opportunities to spend time together naturally became less frequent. Both men remained busy with projects that demanded their attention. Newman poured more energy into philanthropy through his enormously successful food company and charitable foundation, while continuing to support causes close to his heart. Redford immersed himself in directing, environmental advocacy, and building the Sundance Institute into a home for independent filmmakers. Neither had stopped caring about the other. Life had simply become crowded. Looking back, Redford seemed to realize that good intentions aren't always enough to preserve the closeness people assume will always be there. In several interviews over the years, he described Newman as someone who possessed extraordinary generosity, not only with money or fame, but with people. Newman had a gift for making those around him feel comfortable. He could lighten serious moments with humor, listen without dominating conversations, and make success appear almost effortless. Redford openly admired those qualities. Yet admiration also came with reflection. He acknowledged that there were periods when they simply didn't see each other very often. They stayed connected through mutual respect and occasional conversations, but the everyday familiarity that audiences imagined wasn't always possible. That realization wasn't presented as a scandal. It was presented as a regret. For some viewers, those admissions felt almost unsettling because they challenged a comforting Hollywood myth. Fans wanted to believe that iconic friendships remained frozen in time, that the chemistry visible on screen continued unchanged for decades. Reality rarely works that way. Friendships evolve. People change. Responsibilities multiply. Even the strongest relationships require time, and time is often the one thing success takes away. Redford's willingness to acknowledge that reality made his memories of Newman feel more authentic than sentimental. He often emphasized that what mattered wasn't how frequently they spoke, but the foundation they had built years earlier. There was a level of trust between them that didn't disappear simply because their lives became busier. Still, one thought seemed to linger beneath many of his interviews. What if they had made more time? It's a question that cannot be answered, and perhaps that's why it carried so much emotional weight. After Newman's passing, Redford attended tributes and remembered his friend with unmistakable affection. He spoke about Newman's integrity, professionalism, and remarkable ability to remain grounded despite extraordinary fame. But there was another layer to those memories. Redford wasn't only mourning an actor. He was mourning an entire chapter of his own life. Every memory of Newman also brought back memories of youth, early success, creative excitement, and a Hollywood that no longer existed. Losing Newman meant losing one of the few people who truly understood those experiences firsthand. That kind of loss cannot be replaced. As Redford grew older, his interviews became less about celebrity and more about perspective. Fame, awards, and legendary performances seemed less important than the relationships built along the way. His reflections suggested that accomplishments eventually fade into history. People don't. Those comments led some headlines to suggest Redford had finally broken his silence, or revealed a hidden truth. In reality, the truth was quieter, and arguably more profound. There was no explosive confession, no secret feud, no dramatic falling out. Instead, Redford offered something much rarer in Hollywood. An honest acknowledgement that even the deepest friendships can be imperfect, shaped by distance, changing priorities, and the painful realization that there is never as much time as we think. And as he continued reflecting on those years, one question became impossible to ignore. If there had been no scandal between them, why did Redford still sound as though he wished he could go back and change something? That answer lies in the years when success, separate passions, and the passage of time slowly transformed one of Hollywood's most admired friendships. By the late 1970s, Robert Redford and Paul Newman had reached a level of success that few actors in Hollywood history could match. Their names alone could attract audiences. Their films were becoming classics, and their reputations extended far beyond the movie industry. To the public, it seemed they had everything. But success often comes with a hidden cost. The busier life becomes, the harder it is to hold onto the relationships that once felt effortless. For Newman and Redford, that reality unfolded gradually rather than dramatically. There was no public argument, no bitter interview, no explosive fallout that tabloids could point to. Instead, the distance developed quietly, almost invisibly. Each man was building a life that demanded his complete attention. Paul Newman had long been interested in automobile racing, but what began as a hobby evolved into a genuine passion. He competed seriously, earned the respect of professional drivers, and spent increasing amounts of time at racetracks around the country. Racing wasn't simply an escape from Hollywood. It became another part of who he was. At the same time, Newman devoted enormous energy to philanthropy. His food company, Newman's Own, grew into an extraordinary charitable enterprise, with profits directed to organizations helping children, families, and communities in need. Rather than treating charity as a publicity opportunity, Newman made it a central mission of his life. Many who worked with him believed this humanitarian legacy meant as much to him as any Academy Award. Robert Redford was pursuing a different dream. While he remained one of Hollywood's leading actors, he became increasingly interested in what happened behind the camera. Directing offered him creative freedom that acting alone couldn't provide. More importantly, he wanted to support filmmakers whose voices might otherwise never be heard. That vision eventually led to the growth of the Sundance Institute and the Sundance Film Festival, which became one of the world's most influential platforms for independent cinema. Redford wasn't simply building another film event. He was trying to reshape the future of filmmaking. Both men were following deeply personal callings. Both believed they were spending their time on meaningful work. Neither choice left much room for maintaining the kind of regular friendship fans imagined. Years passed. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits became harder to arrange. The bond remained, but the rhythm of the relationship had changed. To outsiders, those changes fueled endless speculation. Entertainment magazines occasionally hinted that the two legends had drifted apart. Some writers even suggested hidden jealousy. After all, Hollywood had conditioned audiences to expect rivalries between successful stars. If two famous actors weren't constantly appearing together, surely something had gone wrong. But those theories ignored a much simpler explanation. Real life. Friends don't always grow apart because they stop caring. Sometimes they grow apart because responsibilities quietly fill every available space. Redford himself would later suggest that this was the real story. Whenever he discussed Newman, his words carried warmth, not resentment. He praised Newman's intelligence. He admired his generosity. He respected the remarkable balance Newman maintained between celebrity, family, and philanthropy. There was never any indication that bitterness had replaced friendship. Yet there was something else, an unmistakable awareness that time had changed everything. As both men entered later stages of their careers, they also began reflecting more often on what truly mattered. Awards? They were nice. Box office success? Temporary. Critical acclaim? Important but fleeting. The relationships built throughout those decades became increasingly valuable. In hindsight, Redford seemed to recognize that he and Newman had shared something exceptionally rare. Hollywood partnerships often burn brightly before collapsing under pressure. The entertainment industry has countless stories of friendships destroyed by competition, contracts, or personal disputes. Their relationship had avoided those traps. That alone made it remarkable. But avoiding conflict wasn't the same as avoiding regret. As Newman grew older, reports about his declining health gradually became public. While his family understandably protected his privacy, it became clear that age was beginning to take its toll. Friends understood that time was becoming precious. For Redford, those years carried a quiet emotional weight. He knew the opportunities to reconnect were becoming fewer. Every postponed visit suddenly mattered more. Every conversation felt more significant. Looking back years later, he would never suggest that they had left on bad terms. Instead, he spoke as someone who wished there had simply been more moments, more conversations, more shared memories, more chances to say things that often get postponed because we assume there will always be another tomorrow. That realization resonates far beyond Hollywood. It is something almost everyone experiences eventually. We become consumed by careers, by responsibilities, by projects we believe cannot wait. Only later do we realize that relationships are measured not by intention, but by time spent together. For Redford, Paul Newman became a powerful reminder of that lesson. Not because their friendship failed, but because life moved faster than either of them expected. And as Newman's health continued to decline, Redford found himself confronting a reality he had spent decades avoiding. One day, there would be no more opportunities. When that day finally arrived, it changed the way he looked back on their friendship forever. The loss wasn't simply personal. It marked the end of an era, leaving behind memories that would become both a comfort and a source of lingering regret. When Paul Newman passed away in 2008 at the age of 83, Hollywood lost one of its greatest performers. But for Robert Redford, the loss carried a meaning that went far beyond the world of movies. He wasn't saying goodbye to just a legendary actor. He was saying goodbye to one of the few people who understood an entire chapter of his life. Newman and Redford had shared a unique journey. They had experienced the excitement of becoming cultural icons, the pressure of living under constant public attention, and the strange reality of being remembered by millions of people for characters they played decades earlier. Very few people could understand what that experience felt like. Paul Newman was one of them. That connection was part of what made his passing so difficult. When celebrities die, the public often focuses on accomplishments. The awards, the famous roles, the records, and the unforgettable moments captured on screen. But those who knew the person behind the image often remember something different. They remember conversations, private jokes, small gestures, moments that never appeared in newspapers or interviews. For Redford, the memories of Newman weren't limited to two famous movies. They stretched across decades. They represented a time when both men were still discovering who they would become. A time before the pressure of being legends. A time before every decision was analyzed by the public. A time when two actors simply showed up on a film set and discovered something unexpected. They worked. That discovery changed both of their lives. After Newman's death, Redford spoke about him with deep affection. He remembered not only Newman's talent but his character, the qualities that made people trust and admire him beyond his performances. Newman had a reputation for being humble despite enormous fame. That was not an easy achievement. Hollywood often rewards confidence, self-promotion, and constant visibility. Newman chose another path. He rarely seemed interested in proving how important he was. Instead, he let his actions speak. That quality was one of the reasons Redford respected him so deeply. But beneath the praise was an emotional truth that many fans noticed. Redford was not simply remembering a colleague. He was grieving a friend. And grief often brings complicated feelings. Even when a relationship is strong, loss can force people to examine everything they wish they had done differently. The conversations they wish they had longer. The visits they wish they had made sooner. The moments they assumed they would have more of. Redford's reflections carried that kind of emotional honesty. He never suggested that he and Newman had some dramatic, unresolved conflict. The reality was much more human. They were two people who loved and respected each other, but who also lived demanding lives. They had families, careers, responsibilities, dreams that required attention. Like millions of people around the world, they discovered that caring about someone and making enough time for them are two different things. That distinction became one of the most powerful lessons from their story. Many fans wanted a more dramatic explanation. They wanted a secret disagreement, a hidden betrayal, a moment when everything changed. But the truth was quieter, and perhaps more painful. Sometimes relationships don't end because of one terrible moment. Sometimes time simply moves forward. Newman's passing also marked the end of something larger. The Hollywood era they represented was disappearing. The industry had changed dramatically since their first collaboration. Movie stars no longer carried the same cultural influence, and the idea of two actors creating that kind of unforgettable partnership had become increasingly rare. For many viewers, Newman and Redford represented something timeless. Their films captured friendship, loyalty, humor, and trust. But their real-life connection revealed something even more relatable. Even extraordinary people experience ordinary struggles. They deal with distance. They miss opportunities. They wish they had more time. That is what made Redford's words resonate. He wasn't describing a perfect friendship. He was describing a real one. A friendship that survived decades of change, different priorities, and long periods apart. A friendship that didn't need constant attention to remain meaningful. In the years following Newman's death, Redford continued honoring his memory. He spoke about him not with the sadness of someone who lost only a professional partner, but with the gratitude of someone who knew he had been fortunate to share a rare connection. Yet one question continued to follow those reflections. If Redford had such deep respect and affection for Newman, what exactly did he wish he could have done differently? because hidden beneath the tributes and memories was a much more personal realization, one that revealed how even the strongest friendships can leave behind moments of regret. And that realization would become the most emotional part of Redford's story about Paul Newman. More than a decade after Paul Newman's passing, the story of his friendship with Robert Redford continues to capture the imagination of audiences around the world. Part of the reason is obvious. Their films created some of Hollywood's most memorable moments. But the deeper reason has less to do with cinema. It has to do with something everyone understands: time. The friendship between Newman and Redford remains powerful because it represents something much more human than fame. It shows that even people who appear to have everything, success, wealth, recognition, and opportunity, still face the same challenges as everyone else. They still lose touch. They still miss moments. They still look back and wonder what they could have done differently. That is what made Redford's reflections so meaningful. He wasn't rewriting history. He wasn't trying to create a dramatic story around two Hollywood legends. He was acknowledging the complicated reality of a lifelong friendship. For years, audiences had seen Newman and Redford as almost fictional figures. Their chemistry in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting created the impression of a connection that was effortless and permanent. But real friendships are not movie scripts. They don't always have perfect timing. They don't always include constant communication. They exist through different seasons of life. And sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones that survive those changes. One of the most fascinating aspects of their relationship was the absence of the usual Hollywood rivalry. The entertainment industry has countless examples of famous personalities competing for attention. Two major stars working together can often lead to tension over recognition, popularity, or creative control. Newman and Redford seemed to avoid that trap. They understood that one person's success did not diminish the others. When one succeeded, the other celebrated. When one took a different career path, the other respected it. That level of mutual admiration was rare. It also explains why fans were so invested in their friendship. People weren't only watching two talented actors. They were watching two individuals who seemed to represent loyalty in an industry where relationships are often temporary. But their story also challenges the idea that every great friendship has to look the same. Some friendships involve daily conversations. Others involve occasional reunions but maintain a deep foundation of respect. Newman and Redford's relationship appeared to fall into the second category. The distance didn't erase the connection. The years apart didn't erase the memories. The changing circumstances didn't erase what they had built. That may be the most important lesson from their story. Not every meaningful relationship is measured by how often two people are together. Sometimes it is measured by the impact they have on each other's lives. For Redford, Newman represented a person connected to a defining period of his journey. He wasn't just someone from his past. He was part of the story of how Robert Redford became Robert Redford. And that kind of connection is impossible to replace. Their story also reveals something uncomfortable about success. People often assume that achieving their dreams will create more freedom, more time, more opportunities to enjoy life. But success can also create new demands, bigger responsibilities, higher expectations, a schedule that never truly slows down. Newman and Redford achieved extraordinary things, but they were still vulnerable to the same problem faced by millions of people. Believing there will always be more time later. That lesson gives their friendship a bittersweet quality. The sadness isn't that they lost respect for each other. The sadness is that life moved forward faster than they realized. And perhaps that is why Redford's comments affected so many people. Because beneath the Hollywood history was a simple human emotion. Regret. Not regret over failure. Not regret over conflict. But regret over moments that passed before anyone realized their importance. The story of Robert Redford and Paul Newman endures because it refuses to be a perfect Hollywood fairy tale. Instead, it is something more honest. It is a story about two extraordinary people who shared an extraordinary connection, while still experiencing the ordinary challenges that come with being human. Their friendship wasn't powerful because it never changed. It was powerful because it changed and survived. But as fans continued looking back at their decades together, one final question remained. Was there something deeper behind Redford's reflections? Something beyond simple nostalgia? Because when he spoke about Newman, there was always a feeling that he wasn't only remembering the past. He was trying to preserve something that time had taken away, and the final piece of their story reveals why those memories meant so much. For years, the story surrounding Robert Redford and Paul Newman was often presented in the simplest possible way. Two legendary actors, two unforgettable movies, one extraordinary friendship. And while that description was not wrong, it never told the entire story. Because behind the images of laughter on movie sets and the chemistry that audiences admired was something far more realistic. A relationship shaped by time, change, distance, and the complicated emotions that come with looking back on a life that moved faster than expected. When Redford reflected on Newman after his passing, many people searched for a dramatic revelation. They expected a hidden conflict, a secret disagreement, a shocking reason why the two icons were not constantly seen together in their later years. But the truth was not something explosive. It was something much more personal. The silence between them was never necessarily a sign of anger. It was often the silence that happens when two people deeply respect each other but become separated by the responsibilities of life. And perhaps that reality made their story even more powerful. Because if there had been betrayal, it would have been easier to understand. If there had been a public feud, fans could point to a specific moment when everything changed. But there wasn't. There was simply time passing. And time is often the one thing people underestimate. Looking back, Redford seemed to understand that Newman represented more than a successful collaboration. He represented a connection to a different era. A period when both men were younger, ambitious, and discovering what their futures would become. Before the awards. Before the legendary status. Before the world started calling them icons. They were simply two actors who found themselves working together and discovering a creative partnership that audiences would never forget. That is why Newman's loss carried such emotional weight. It wasn't only the loss of a friend. It was the loss of a living connection to the past. A person who remembered the beginning. A person who understood the journey. A person who had been there before the world knew their names. Those relationships become increasingly rare as people grow older. Many people accumulate achievements throughout their lives, but fewer people remain who can truly say, "I was there before all of this happened." For Redford, Newman was one of those people. And perhaps that is the biggest reason his reflections felt so emotional. He wasn't just remembering a co-star. He was remembering a witness to his entire transformation. From a young actor trying to find his place in Hollywood to one of the industry's most respected filmmakers and cultural figures, Redford's journey was connected to many people. But very few shared the earliest chapters with him the way Newman did. That connection cannot be recreated. It exists only in memory. The story of Redford and Newman also reminds audiences that public images rarely capture the full reality of people's lives. Fans saw two men who appeared to have everything figured out. They saw success. They saw admiration. They saw a friendship that seemed almost too perfect. But behind every famous face is a person dealing with the same challenges everyone else faces. Trying to balance work and relationships. Trying to make time for the people who matter. Trying to appreciate moments before they become memories. That is what makes their story timeless. Not the fame. Not the movies. Not even the Hollywood history. The humanity. Because at the center of everything was a simple truth. Robert Redford cared deeply about Paul Newman. And Paul Newman clearly left a lasting mark on Robert Redford's life. Their friendship did not need constant public appearances to be meaningful. It did not need endless interviews or dramatic declarations. Its importance was already proven by the way Redford continued speaking about him years later. With admiration, with affection, and with a sense that some people can never truly be replaced. The biggest misunderstanding about their relationship may have been believing that distance meant the bond had disappeared. Sometimes distance simply means life became complicated. Sometimes silence doesn't mean there is nothing left to say. Sometimes silence means there is too much. And perhaps that is the real reason Redford's reflections continue to resonate. Because beneath the Hollywood legends, beneath the famous films, And beneath the headlines was a story about something far more universal. A friendship, a lifetime, and the painful realization that even the greatest moments are temporary. In the end, Robert Redford and Paul Newman were not remembered because they had a perfect relationship. They were remembered because they had a real one filled with admiration, laughter, shared history, and the kind of connection that survives even after goodbye. And maybe the most important lesson from their story is not about what they lost. It is about what they were fortunate enough to have in the first place.